Amelia Madison, the icy chief executive of Madison Aerotech, lost her composure inside a hangar blazing with morning light. The rescue jet behind her, worth $50 million, shuddered violently in front of the board in a room of investors. Mason Carter, a quiet single father working as a maintenance technician, stepped forward to warn that the stabilizer system had been wrongly calibrated. Amelia tore the manual from an engineer's hands and hurled it against his chest, screaming at him to read the instructions. Mason knelt, opened the cover, and the hangar went silent. His own name was printed there. To learn exactly who erased Mason Carter's name from the history of that aircraft, stay until the very last moment. The story began at Madison Aerotech, a private aviation corporation preparing to unveil its newest rescue jet before a room full of skeptical eyes. The demonstration was set to take place inside a vast aircraft hangar in Texas where daylight poured through the massive open doors and lit the concrete floor like a stage built for judgment. This new rescue aircraft carried a singular purpose: to fly directly into hurricanes, wildfires, and disaster zones to evacuate people trapped where no ordinary aircraft dared to go. If the demonstration succeeded, Madison Aerotech would secure a contract worth billions of dollars from federal agencies and international rescue organizations. A deal that would define the company for a generation. Amelia Madison was the young chief executive behind that ambition. Brilliant and disciplined, but cold in a way that made people choose their words carefully around her. She believed in structure, in reputation, and above all in speed. Somewhere near the edge of that same hangar stood a man almost nobody noticed. A maintenance technician named Mason Carter. He spoke rarely, arrived earlier than anyone else, and checked small details that other people had long since stopped bothering to see. Mason was a single father, though that part of his life stayed folded quietly beneath the surface of his days, mentioned only through the steady responsibility that shaped how carefully he worked. What no one in that hangar remembered, or perhaps had simply chosen to forget, was that Mason had once been the lead engineer behind the jet stabilization architecture, a system known internally as Airlock 7. That system existed for one reason alone: to keep an aircraft balanced when its engines were pushed to their absolute limits under violent, unpredictable conditions. Years earlier, a man named Logan Wyatt had taken credit for Mason's design, quietly stripping his name from every official manual and reshaping the narrative of a failed early test to make Mason look like the one responsible for the disaster. Joseph Samuel, the longtime chief engineer, had known fragments of the truth back then, but he had said nothing, choosing silence because it protected the career he had spent decades building. Today, inside this same bright hangar, none of that history was visible on the surface. The floor gleamed under fluorescent light. Investors mingled near catered tables and a military liaison reviewed specification sheets with quiet interest. Nobody there suspected that the quiet man in the maintenance uniform held the one truth capable of unraveling everything the company had built on a foundation of theft and silence. The hangar had been arranged like a stage built for a high-technology performance rather than an ordinary aircraft inspection. The rescue jet sat at the center of the open floor. Its fuselage gleaming in silver and white, the engine cowling opened for a final visual check, while engineers, investors, and a military delegation circled it with quiet anticipation. Amelia walked in with the practiced confidence of someone who had rehearsed this moment for months. Though beneath that composed exterior sat a pressure she rarely let anyone witness, the knowledge that this single contract could decide the company's entire future. Mason stood near the edge of the hangar in his maintenance uniform, listening to a faint vibration coming from the tail stabilizer assembly, a sound too subtle for most people in the room to register at all. A younger engineer nearby made a passing remark that Mason only needed to wipe grease and tighten bolts. That understanding the deeper mechanics of a rescue jet's propulsion system was well beyond his job description. Mason ignored the remark because something else had caught his attention. A signal from the engine's directional control that did not match the expected feedback rhythm of the balancing wing assembly. He crossed the floor and quietly told Joseph that the test should not proceed as scheduled. Joseph's expression shifted the moment he heard it because some part of him recognized that Mason was almost certainly right. Yet fear of Logan kept the words trapped behind his teeth. Logan arrived moments later, his tone friendly on the surface. Though he used the opportunity to diminish Mason in front of the gathered crowd with practiced ease, Amelia overheard the exchange from a short distance and assumed Mason was simply trying to sabotage a demonstration that meant everything to her company's survival. Mason remained calm and explained that if the rescue simulation mode were activated, the engine would automatically compensate force in the wrong direction, a flaw hidden somewhere inside the current calibration. Amelia asked him not unkindly but pointedly what authority he believed he had to question her top engineering team. Logan answered before Mason could, claiming the man had a history of discipline problems and could not be trusted around sensitive equipment. Amelia waited the moment for only a second before giving the order to proceed with the test as planned. Mason said nothing further. He simply looked toward the aircraft, understanding with quiet certainty that within a matter of minutes, whatever flaw had been buried inside that manual would surface in front of everyone standing in that hangar, whether they were prepared for it or not. The investors settled into their observation seats along the hangar wall, and the military liaison lifted a tablet to record telemetry readings as the crew prepared the ignition sequence. Joseph moved toward the control station with visible tension in his shoulders, glancing once toward Mason as though hoping for a signal that everything might still be stopped. Logan, meanwhile, positioned himself near Amelia, ready to narrate the achievement as his own the moment the engines proved stable. A technician called out the countdown and the hangar fell into that particular hush that precedes every high-stakes test. A silence thick enough that even small footsteps sounded loud against the concrete. The engine roared to life and the sound rolled through the hangar in a wave that made several investors instinctively step backward. For the first few seconds, every reading on the diagnostic screens looked stable, and Amelia allowed herself a small breath of relief. Convinced that Mason's warnings had been nothing more than an overcautious man's imagination, Logan seized the moment to begin his present, telling the room that the Airlock 7 system would allow this rescue jet to perform reliably under the harshest conditions imaginable. Mason stood a few steps behind the crowd, his attention locked entirely on the balancing wing and the pressure valve cluster mounted near the tail section. He noticed the vibration begin to shift out of rhythm, a pattern he recognized instantly because it mirrored the exact flaw that had destroyed his career years earlier. Mason stepped forward and asked firmly this time that the test be halted immediately. Security moved to block his path before he could reach the control station. Amelia's anger flared, certain that he was about to humiliate her in front of the very people whose confidence she needed most. Mason told her plainly that if the engine shifted into high-load mode, the system would push a counterforce in the wrong direction and could fracture the propulsion shaft entirely. Logan cut him off, insisting that Mason simply did not understand the updated manual. At that exact moment, the engine let out a sharp shriek. The fuselage shuddered violently and tools clattered off a nearby technical table onto the concrete floor. An engineer entered the shutdown command, but the system responded far too slowly. Investors backed away from the aircraft and the military liaison demanded an explanation in a tone that left no room for delay. Amelia's fear surged, and rather than let it show, she converted it instantly into fury. She snatched the manual from the chief engineer's hands and hurled it against Mason's chest with a force that startled everyone nearby. She screamed at him to read the instructions, calling him a fool in front of the entire assembled crowd. The hangar fell into absolute silence. Mason did not respond to the insult at all. He bent down, retrieved the manual from the floor, brushed the dust from its cover, and then slowly, deliberately turned it back to the very first page in front of Amelia's stunned expression. Behind Amelia, the investors exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether they were witnessing a technical failure or a public relations disaster in the making. Joseph's hands trembled slightly at the control station, torn between the instinct to intervene and years of habitual silence. Logan's expression flickered for just a moment, a flash of something closer to alarm than confidence, though he quickly buried it beneath his usual composure. The military liaison lowered his tablet and watched Mason with new interest, sensing that whatever was about to unfold mattered far more than the scripted demonstration he had come to observe. A junior investor near the back murmured that he had never seen a maintenance worker command a room the way Mason just had, and nobody around him offered a reply. The temperature in the hangar seemed to drop, not from any change in the air, but from the sudden collective realization that everything they thought they understood about this project might be wrong. Amelia's fingers tightened around the edge of the manual, her mind racing through every report she had ever signed without reading closely enough. She had trusted Logan completely, had built her entire understanding of Airlock 7 on his word alone. And now that trust felt like sand slipping through her hands in front of the very people she needed to impress most. On the cover of the original Airlock 7 manual, the lead author's name stood printed in plain black letters, Mason Carter. Amelia froze, certain for a moment that her eyes had deceived her. She pulled the manual back from him and studied the lines more carefully, as though the ink itself might rearrange into something less impossible. Logan spoke quickly, insisting that this was simply an outdated document with no remaining value to the current program. Mason answered calmly that he had not only authored that manual, but had designed the core stabilization mechanism of Airlock 7 from the ground up. The military liaison asked with obvious confusion why the author of such a critical system was currently dressed in a maintenance uniform inside this hangar. Joseph finally found his voice and confirmed that Mason had once been the most important contract engineer on the entire project. Amelia turned toward Joseph, her shock quickly hardening into anger. Joseph admitted that Mason had been blamed for an old test failure years earlier, despite having warned the team about the exact flaw beforehand. Logan dismissed the accusation as slander, his voice rising with practiced indignation. Mason refused to be drawn into the argument because the aircraft behind them was still shaking. He asked Amelia for 90 seconds, a set of insulated tools and access to a secondary control panel. Amelia hesitated, aware that trusting Mason now meant admitting she had just humiliated the wrong person in front of everyone who mattered to her company. But the engine noise grew more dangerous by the second, and she had no real alternative left. She gave a single, reluctant nod. Mason opened a technical panel beneath the aircraft's belly, a hidden emergency access point that only the system's original designer would have known existed. While the room's attention remained fixed on Mason and the shuddering jet, Logan quietly slipped away toward the data room, intending to erase every trace of his tampering with the manual before anyone thought to look. Amelia caught the motion from the corner of her eye and watched him go. A cold, uncomfortable suspicion began forming in her mind, one she was not yet ready to name aloud, but one that would not leave her alone for the rest of that morning. An investor near the front leaned toward a colleague and whispered a question about whether the demonstration would need to be rescheduled entirely, and the colleague simply shook her head, unable to offer an answer. The military liaison stepped closer to the aircraft, watching Mason's hands move with a precision that seemed entirely at odds with the maintenance uniform he wore. Joseph stood frozen near the control panel, caught between old loyalty to Logan and a mounting guilt that had waited years to surface. Somewhere behind them, a junior technician quietly recorded the timestamp of everything unfolding, sensing that this moment would matter later, even if she did not yet understand why. Amelia found herself replaying every meeting she had ever held with Logan, searching for a moment where she might have caught the deception earlier if she had simply asked one more question. She remembered how convincingly he had spoken about safety margins and engineering rigor, how easily she had accepted his version of events without demanding independent verification. Now standing in the very hangar where her company's future would be decided, she understood that her trust had been given to the wrong man for far too long. The realization did not arrive gently. It landed with the weight of every decision she had made based on a lie she never thought to question. Mason worked beneath the aircraft's belly while the engine roared above him, issuing short, clear instructions to each engineer without a trace of panic in his voice. He ordered the auto-compensation module disabled and the system switched over to the mechanical backup stabilization mode. One of the engineers told him that the updated manual contained no such mode at all. Mason replied simply that someone had deliberately removed it from the newer version. Amelia heard that sentence and felt a chill move through her. Mason opened the hidden technical port and connected a diagnostic device directly into the Airlock 7 core. The reading slowly appeared on his handheld screen, revealing that the compensation algorithm had been altered in a way that made the system respond incorrectly under pressure. He reduced the feedback pressure step by step, locked the engine shaft, and guided the balancing wing back into a safe resting position. The violent shaking gradually eased. The fuselage stopped trembling. A breathless kind of relief swept through the hangar, quiet and heavy all at once. Mason set his tools down and stated plainly that the fault had never belonged to the aircraft itself, but to a manual that had been deliberately altered. Logan returned at that moment, demanding that security escort Mason out of the hangar for what he called unauthorized interference. Amelia nearly gave the order out of habit, but she stopped herself before the words left her mouth. She asked Mason instead why he had not spoken the truth sooner. Mason answered that he had tried for 3 years, but his emails vanished. His reports were buried. His name had been erased from every official record connected to the project. Evelyn Grace, standing near the back of the crowd, went pale because she remembered seeing a strikingly similar file cross her desk once before. Mason asked that someone immediately pull the manual's complete revision history. Amelia gave the order to lock down the entire aviation data archive without delay. Logan understood in that instant that the careful mask he had worn for years had finally begun to crack in front of everyone who mattered. Joseph moved closer to Mason, his voice low, and admitted that he had suspected something was wrong long before today, but had lacked the courage to challenge Logan directly. Mason listened without offering forgiveness or blame, focused instead on the engine readings still stabilizing on the screen in front of him. The military liaison approached Amelia and asked quietly whether the entire fleet of rescue jets currently in production carried the same altered firmware. Amelia did not have an answer yet, and the uncertainty in her expression told the room more than any words could have. Evelyn began pulling personnel files from an older archive, searching for any record that might confirm what she already suspected about Mason's original role on the project. A young engineer watching from a distance asked another technician quietly how someone with Mason's obvious skill had ended up assigned to maintenance work in the first place. Neither of them had an answer, though both now suspected the truth was far darker than a simple career setback. Amelia overheard the question and felt it settle uncomfortably in her chest. A small reminder that an entire company had failed to notice what was happening in plain sight for years. She resolved silently that once this crisis passed, she would personally review every engineer who had ever been quietly pushed aside under circumstances that no longer made sense to her. Amelia moved the entire crisis team into the control room tucked inside the hangar's rear wall. Evelyn reopened the old legal files connected to the Airlock 7 project, searching page by page for anything that might explain what had happened. She found an old confidentiality agreement that had once been used to force Mason out of the design division entirely. Mason gave a brief account of his past, explaining that he had developed a protective layer designed to stop the engine from compensating in the wrong direction whenever its sensors became unreliable. Logan back then had pressured him to overlook that flaw so the launch schedule would stay on track. Mason had refused to sign off on the system as safe. Not long after, a test had been deliberately run using a faulty version of the firmware. Logan shifted the blame onto Mason, costing him his engineering position and forcing him back into the industry through a maintenance role instead. Amelia needed evidence, not simply a story told after the fact, however convincing it sounded. Evelyn located a chain of old emails whose sender information had been quietly altered. Joseph recalled the exact night the original files disappeared, remembering that Logan had been the only person with access at the time. A system alert flashed across the main screen, warning that someone was currently logged in without authorization from a secondary server room. Mason guessed immediately that Logan was attempting to erase the manual's revision logs before anyone could examine them closely. Amelia, Mason, and a pair of security officers moved quickly toward that server room at the back of the hangar. Logan had locked the glass door from the inside. On the monitor behind him, a deletion process was already running. Logan laughed coldly, telling them that once the data disappeared, Mason would remain nothing more than a talkative maintenance worker for the rest of his career. Mason looked upward at the wiring running along the ceiling and realized that this auxiliary room still used an emergency circuit he himself had designed years earlier. He asked Amelia once more to trust him just a little longer. Evelyn stayed close behind them, her tablet already open to the confidentiality agreement she had found minutes earlier, ready to compare its language against whatever surfaced next. The security officers positioned themselves near the glass door, watching Logan through the reflective surface as he worked frantically at the terminal inside. Amelia felt her pulse quicken, torn between the instinct to storm the door immediately and the awareness that Mason clearly understood this system far better than anyone else present. Joseph stood a few paces back, his earlier confession still hanging in the air between them, uncertain whether his honesty had come too late to matter. Somewhere above them, the emergency circuit hummed faintly, a piece of infrastructure that had waited years for exactly this moment to prove its purpose. Logan's voice carried faintly through the glass, edged with a desperation that had not been there minutes earlier, when he still believed he controlled the narrative. He shouted that none of this would matter once the files were gone, that a maintenance worker's word would never outweigh years of carefully constructed reputation. Amelia listened to him and felt something cold settle in her chest, a recognition that the man she had trusted with operations for years had never once hesitated to sacrifice another person to protect himself. Mason worked steadily through the noise, unaffected by the shouting, his focus entirely on the sequence of connections in front of him. Mason opened an emergency junction box mounted just outside the server room and began working with quick, deliberate movements. Amelia watched him closely, and for the first time she recognized the precision of a genuine engineer rather than the careless technician she had assumed him to be for months. Inside the room, Logan pushed the deletion process to run faster, his composure cracking with every passing second. Evelyn warned that they had less than a minute left before everything vanished permanently. Mason explained that the original system design included a tamper-resistant memory bank, one built specifically to preserve every change ever made to the manual and its firmware. Amelia asked why such a critical safeguard was missing from the current version of the manual entirely. Mason looked toward Logan through the glass and answered that it was missing because it preserved the fingerprints of the person who had betrayed the project. He reconnected the circuit and activated a data freeze command through the auxiliary system. The deletion process stopped abruptly at 97% completion. The server room door unlocked automatically. Security moved in and restrained Logan before he could reach for anything else on the terminal. The recovered data revealed that Logan had erased Mason's name from the manual, stripped out the emergency stabilization layer entirely, and transferred authorship credit to his own team without hesitation. Worse still, he had sold a simplified version of the design to a rival contractor for personal profit. Amelia stood in stunned silence, finally understanding the full extent to which she had been manipulated for years without ever realizing it. Logan insisted that everything he had done was simply a strategy meant to save the company from falling behind schedule. Mason answered quietly that in aviation, a single deleted line inside a manual could quietly transform into a funeral instead. The room fell completely silent after those words. Amelia suspended Logan on the spot without hesitation or ceremony. Mason then warned her of something far more dangerous, that the same faulty firmware might already have been installed on other aircraft still undergoing testing elsewhere on the property. If even one of those jets rolled onto the runway that same day, a real catastrophe could still unfold before anyone had the chance to stop it. Evelyn immediately began printing the recovered files, aware that physical copies would matter as much as digital ones once lawyers and investigators became involved. Joseph offered to help identify which aircraft had received the compromised firmware update. Working quickly through a maintenance log that Logan had never thought to alter. The military liaison, who had witnessed the entire confrontation unfold, quietly stepped aside to place a call to his own command. Uncertain yet whether this incident would remain a private corporate matter or become something far larger, Amelia felt the full weight of the morning settle over her at once, the humiliation of having thrown the manual at Mason now inseparable from the relief of having narrowly avoided disaster. She looked at him and for the first time since they had met, saw not a maintenance technician, but the man who had quietly protected her company for years without recognition or thanks. Security led Logan out of the server room in restraints. His protest growing weaker as the recovered files paged past on the monitor behind him for anyone to see. Amelia watched him go without a trace of satisfaction, only a heavy, exhausted sadness at how long she had allowed herself to be deceived. Mason gathered his tools quietly, aware that the day's danger was far from over, with other aircraft still waiting somewhere on the property. He glanced at Amelia and told her without any bitterness in his voice that the real work was only just beginning. Amelia gathered an emergency team directly inside the hangar within minutes of Logan's arrest. Several board members wanted to delay any public disclosure of the flaw, worried that admitting the truth now would cost them the contract entirely. Mason told them plainly that anyone still thinking about stock prices before crew safety had no business building aircraft at all. One board member asked with visible irritation why an ordinary maintenance worker deserved to be listened to at all. Amelia looked the man directly in the eye and reminded him that this same maintenance worker had just saved a $50 million aircraft from destruction. That moment marked a real turning point for Amelia. The instant she began protecting the truth instead of protecting appearances. Mason quickly reviewed the list of every aircraft that had received the newer firmware update. 3 jets sat inside the secondary testing zone, and one of them was already being towed toward the runway for its scheduled flight. Mason outlined a plan on the spot, locking remote updates, restoring the original airlock 7 stabilization layer, and manually inspecting each engine cluster before anything left the ground. Joseph assisted him without hesitation, offering a public apology for his long silence. Mason had not yet fully forgiven him, but he accepted the help regardless because safety mattered more than any personal grievance in that moment. Evelyn continued gathering evidence against Logan, building a case that grew stronger with every document she uncovered. Logan attempted to call an outside associate for help, but the call was intercepted before it connected. Amelia discovered that Logan had also prepared falsified documents intended to shift blame onto her personally if any aircraft had gone down during testing. She understood with a cold clarity that he had been prepared to sacrifice both her and Mason without a second thought. Mason and the technical team ran toward the runway, determined to stop that third aircraft before its engines ever reached full power. Behind them, the crisis room remained tense, board members trading uneasy glances as the reality of the situation settled in fully. One director quietly asked Evelyn whether the company could still salvage its reputation once the public learned how close disaster had come. Evelyn answered honestly that reputation would depend entirely on how transparently they handled the next several hours, not on how well they managed to hide the truth. Amelia overheard the exchange and felt a flicker of something like clarity, a sense that the choices she made in the coming minutes would define the kind of executive she truly wanted to be. Security escorted Logan toward a holding office near the administrative wing, his protests growing quieter with every step. As though he finally understood there was no version of events left that could save him. Joseph radioed ahead to the runway crew, instructing them to hold the aircraft in place until Mason arrived, though he offered no explanation beyond the word emergency, hoping it would be enough to buy the time they needed. The sun climbed higher over the tarmac as Mason's group crossed the open pavement between the hangar and the runway, heat rising visibly off the concrete in wavering lines. A ground crew member spotted them approaching and immediately halted the towing procedure without waiting for further instruction. Sensing from Mason's pace alone that something serious was unfolding, Amelia matched his stride the entire way. No longer thinking about contracts or investors, focused only on reaching that aircraft before its engines climbed to dangerous power. Every step across that tarmac felt heavier than the last, carrying the full weight of everything the morning had already revealed. The test aircraft had already been towed out of the hangar, its auxiliary engines beginning to spin up according to the day's original schedule. The flight crew had no idea that the firmware they trusted carried a hidden and dangerous flaw. Amelia gave the order to halt the flight, but the test lead requested formal confirmation since the command had arrived later than protocol usually allowed. Amelia took full responsibility publicly, stating clearly that the aircraft risked losing stability and could not be permitted to take off under any circumstance. Mason opened a secondary access panel on the fuselage and discovered that this particular firmware version was even more dangerous than the one installed in the hangar. Logan had programmed a delayed failure mode, one designed so the malfunction would only appear once the aircraft reached its intended testing altitude. Had Mason not caught it in time, the entire flight crew could have faced a genuinely life-threatening situation. Amelia watched him work beneath the harsh midday sun and finally understood that the man she had once dismissed so completely had spent years quietly protecting a company that never once thought to protect him in return. Evelyn handed Amelia the original personnel file recovered from storage. Inside there was clear evidence that Mason had submitted dozens of warnings over the years. Each one dismissed and labeled as exceeding his authority. Mason had once refused a settlement offer specifically because accepting it would have required him to publicly admit fault he never actually bore. He chose maintenance work instead, valuing steady employment, personal dignity, and staying close to an industry he still cared about deeply. Amelia wanted to apologize immediately, but Mason told her that apologies could wait until every aircraft on the property was confirmed safe. That single sentence left her quietly humbled. Word arrived that a fourth aircraft stationed at a distant testing facility had already begun its own startup sequence. Mason decided, without hesitation, that he needed to go there in person. Amelia insisted on traveling with him, unwilling to remain behind, while another crew faced the same hidden danger the runway team had barely escaped. Joseph joined them as well, carrying a portable diagnostic kit and a growing determination to make amends for the years he had spent staying quiet. The flight crew on the runway, now grounded safely, watched the group depart with a mixture of confusion and gratitude, sensing that they had narrowly avoided something none of them fully understood yet. Evelyn stayed behind to coordinate with the legal and safety teams, ensuring that every recovered file was properly secured before Logan's associates outside the company had any chance to interfere. A convoy of vehicles pulled away from the main hangar, carrying Mason, Amelia, and Joseph toward the secondary testing facility as the midday sun climbed higher over the Texas tarmac. During the drive, Amelia asked Mason quietly how he had managed to stay so calm through years of being disbelieved and pushed aside. Mason answered that anger would not have fixed a single stabilizer or saved a single flight crew. And somewhere along the way, he had decided that competence mattered more to him than being believed. Joseph listened from the back seat, saying nothing, though the answer clearly settled somewhere deep and uncomfortable within him. Amelia found herself studying Mason's profile as he watched the road ahead, wondering how many other people in her company had learned to survive by staying quiet and simply doing their jobs well despite everything working against them. Mason, Amelia, Joseph, and the technical team arrived at the secondary testing facility just as the fourth aircraft prepared to run its engines at high load. Mason ordered an immediate halt. Logan, still restrained by security back at the main hangar, continued shouting over a monitored line that Mason was deliberately trying to destroy the company. Amelia demanded that the firmware log be displayed publicly in front of the board, the military delegation, and the remaining investors gathered around a temporary screen. Mason placed the original manual beside the altered version for everyone present to see. He pointed to each deleted line one at a time. The emergency stabilization layer, the force compensation limit, and the tamper-resistant memory port that had once protected the entire system. He then opened the firmware revision log where Logan's access credentials appeared in unmistakable detail. Joseph confirmed that those particular credentials belonged only to senior executive personnel. Evelyn presented legal documentation, showing that Logan had transferred authorship away from Mason using falsified paperwork. Logan lost his composure completely and blurted out that Mason should have disappeared from the aviation industry 3 years earlier. That single sentence became a confession in front of numerous witnesses. Amelia announced that Madison Aerotech would recall every altered manual immediately, suspend the commercial rollout entirely, and cooperate fully with any investigation that followed. Several board members objected, citing the enormous financial losses such a decision would cause. Amelia answered that the true cost was what happened when an aviation company chose to ignore the one person telling the truth. Mason finished the final correction to the fourth aircraft system. The engine ran smoothly. The balancing wing responded with perfect accuracy. This time there was no eager applause, only the quiet, grateful silence of people who understood exactly how close they had come to tragedy. The military liaison approached Amelia afterward and told her plainly that his agency would need a full written account of everything that had happened that day, from the original design theft to the attempted cover-up. Amelia agreed without hesitation, understanding that transparency now mattered more than any contract ever could. Joseph stood near Mason as the crew powered down the fourth aircraft, quietly thanking him for allowing the help despite everything that had happened between them. Evelyn began coordinating with outside counsel, preparing the full evidentiary record for whatever legal proceedings would follow in the coming weeks. Word of the incident spread quickly through the company, and by early afternoon, engineers across every department were quietly asking how a story like Mason's had gone unnoticed for so long. A senior director who had objected loudest to the recall found himself the following week reviewing the same firmware logs Mason had exposed. And by the end of that review, he no longer had any argument left to make. Amelia held a short meeting with the remaining board members that afternoon, laying out a plan for full disclosure to regulators and to the public rather than allowing the story to surface piecemeal through outside sources. Mason returned briefly to the original hangar to check on the first aircraft, the one that had started the entire chain of events that morning and found it standing quietly under normal lighting. Its earlier violence nothing more than a memory now. Weeks later, Logan faced formal prosecution for engineering fraud, theft of intellectual property, and concealment of aviation safety risks. Madison Aeroch underwent an extensive internal investigation that touched nearly every department connected to the Airlock 7 program. Amelia did not shy away from accountability. She publicly acknowledged that a culture of arrogance inside her own company had pushed a brilliant engineer down into the lowest position available simply because it was easier than confronting an uncomfortable truth. Mason was formally invited to return as the company's director of flight safety, a role created specifically because of what he had proven that day. He did not accept immediately. Instead, he laid out 3 conditions before agreeing to anything. Every technical warning would be reviewed openly rather than dismissed behind closed doors. Every manual would carry the name of its true author without exception. No contract, regardless of its value, would ever again be placed above the lives of a flight crew. Amelia agreed to each condition in front of the full board without hesitation or negotiation. Joseph apologized to Mason once more, this time privately for the years of silence that had cost him so much. Mason told him that silence caused real harm. But if Joseph spent the rest of his career protecting younger engineers from the same fate, he would hold no lasting resentment toward him. Evelyn presented Mason with the fully restored authorship rights and patent documentation connected to his original design. The story's final scene returned to the same hangar, now bathed once again in daylight. The rescue jet underwent another test, this time without theatrical staging, only a genuine technical team following rigorous safety protocols from beginning to end. Amelia stood before the gathered engineers and formally introduced Mason as the original designer of the Airlock 7 system. Mason looked down at the fresh manual resting on the technical table in front of him. On its cover, his name appeared clearly and permanently. Amelia said very little. She simply placed the manual into his hands with quiet, genuine respect. Mason closed the cover gently. Inside that same vast hangar, no one would ever be able to erase his name again. Outside, the Texas sun climbed higher over the runway, and the hangar doors stood open to the warm afternoon air. Engineers moved through their checklists with a quiet new seriousness, aware that every signature they placed on a document now carried real weight. Amelia walked the floor slowly, stopping occasionally to speak with technicians she had barely acknowledged in the past, asking questions and actually listening to the answers. Mason returned to his old workbench one final time, gathering the few personal tools he had kept there through the long years of being overlooked. He would carry them into his new office down the hall, a reminder of where he had started and how far honesty alone had carried him. Joseph watched him go and for the first time in years felt something close to peace settle over the hangar he had worked in for most of his career. Every industry has its own version of Mason Carter.